Okay, we're going to begin our lecture today. If you can take a seat, please. So today's lecture is a bit of an experimental one. I will speak for half of the lecture time about Simone de Beauvoir. Hello? Okay. Hello, for those of you in the back, we're actually beginning the lecture. So the lecture is a bit different today. It's going to be divided between me and Dr. Angela Harutyuyan. I will speak for the first half of the lecture about Simone de Beauvoir's text that you will be looking at this week. And then in the second half of the lecture, my colleague will present to you some of the influences of de Beauvoir's feminist ideas on artistic practices. Okay, so you're going to get somewhat a lecture that's very much related to the text that you're looking at, as well as the implications of some of the ideas in the text that you're looking at on something like artistic practice or aesthetic forms. Okay, so this week's author and reading take us to a formative moment of the 20th century. Simone de Beauvoir was writing in an intellectual and political milieu that was both highly formative for her thought and within which she made an undeniable mark by framing the field of feminist politics and scholarship. So the context is France in the mid-20th century. The time is a moment in which leftist politics, and in particular the student movements, or the student uprisings of '68 were surging. And de Beauvoir was very much engaged from the very beginning in both her literary and more philosophical texts with responding to the kind of historical, political events unfolding around her then. So she had much to say. She was a harsh critic of Stalinism and the purge trials in the Soviet Union. She had much to say about the fascist German occupation of France and the politics of collaboration and resistance. She had a lot to say about racism in America, about France's war in Algeria, and the politics of colonization. So besides her work on feminism, so all these struggles are somewhat linked for de Beauvoir and her thought. At this time as well in France flourished at least three major schools of thought, all of which influenced her works at different degrees. There was phenomenology and existentialism, which was largely influenced by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger's works. This was a beginning importation of that mode of thought in France, and figures like Jean-Paul Sartre, who was de Beauvoir's longtime partner, was a main pundit of this mode of thinking. There was also Marxism and structuralism, and works or philosophical works that were ongoing that were trying to reframe a somewhat classical antagonism in philosophy and theory between materialism and idealism. There was Kojève's lectures on Hegel in France, Merleau-Ponty's formative text, Humanism and Terror, that was published in 1947. Merleau-Ponty was a French philosopher and public intellectual and a leading proponent of existentialism and phenomenology, who was also of influence on de Beauvoir. So in this context, one of this kind of like theoretical and intellectual effervescence, one of the main questions being debated at the time was, in these circles, who was the question of the subject? Who is the subject of politics? Is it the subject of consciousness? Is it the subject that is reduced to biological life, to sensations and affects? Is it the subject of everyday experience? Who is the subject of feminist politics? Is a question that we can start with precisely from de Beauvoir's declaration, and I quote her, "One is not born a woman, but one becomes a woman." In this sentence, in this formative sentence by de Beauvoir, we find encapsulated what one could call her existentialist ethics, that is based on an idea of existence ultimately preceding an essence. So the subject in this understanding is understood as one that is always constituted within and by a set of concrete socio-symbolic relations. So there's no human nature, there's no first nature. Surely ethics and morality cannot be understood as a second nature if we can't establish a first nature. So despite the many revisions and discussions of her formative text, The Second Sex, which you will be reading this week, de Beauvoir's book remains to be a foundational text for contemporary feminism. The book begins with the question, what is a woman? And in this text, we can see de Beauvoir putting into action what one could call her discursive strategy. She creates a place from within which to speak and write against the dominant discourse of Western capitalist culture at the time. So this dominant discourse was satiated at this moment within which she's writing. It was satiated with representations of motherhood in the post-war France, and the French state was aggressively promoting motherhood through economic incentives and moral appeals. In this context, de Beauvoir refused the questions being posed. She rejected moralism as what she called a form of, to quote her, bourgeois domination. Or as she put it, again, a quote, moralism was the last bastion of bourgeois idealism. Merleau-Ponty, at this time, who was writing as well, had written a critique of liberal humanism and a defense of Marxism's main principle that the subject of consciousness, or the abstract, self-interested, egoistic individual, is only an ideological one. In this text, Ponty placed the phenomenological subject close to a Marxist understanding of the subject. The subject is not one to be found neither in empirical psychology nor through an abstract form of transcendental consciousness. And it is certainly not reducible to the liberal bourgeois subject. It is a subject that is not the abstract subject of consciousness and moralism. And this is very important for de Beauvoir because she identifies the subject of consciousness, as she calls it, against which she is positing her critique as being a masculine subject. So she equates the subject of consciousness with a masculine subject. Masculinity and femininity do not for her refer to identities, of course. They're not simple descriptions of subjects. Rather, masculinity is synonymous for de Beauvoir with an abstract subject, i.e., it is the positive and neutral pole. Man is both the definition of man and the human, both the homme and man and the homo of homo sapien. While woman, de Beauvoir is arguing, is the other, the negative pole that requires to be domesticated within the imaginary wholeness and identity of the masculine. So by saying that the masculine and feminine are not identities but phenomenon that describe reality, analyzing these phenomenon fundamentally means the problematization of ideas of femininity or femaleness, as well as of sexuality and embodiment. So phenomenology, the method that de Beauvoir is putting to work in her discussion, is not somewhat a form of introspective philosophy. It's not about looking inwards towards the self. It's not about the internal processes or activities of the human mind, but about the way in which we relate to the world and its beginning. So the phenomenological question that de Beauvoir poses about sex and sexuality is not what is sex, but why is the sexual relation experienced as a difference and an opposition between these two poles, the masculine and the feminine? Is this a necessary thing? This is the kind of question she's asking. Is this necessary? Can the experience have some other structure? Furthermore, what is the role of philosophy in asking this question? This is de Beauvoir's, to understand kind of the mode of her thinking. She says, if a theory convinced me, it did not remain exterior to me. It changed my relation to the world, colored my experience. In short, I had a sound capacity to adopt a critical sense to develop. For me, philosophy is a living reality. This is the way she's engaging with the task of philosophy. So in this sense, her method of phenomenological suspension or bracketing is not simply about turning in towards oneself, but about becoming conscious of our relations with the world and others. The suspension or the stepping out of the world to question it is not about contesting the reality of the world, but about refusing to accept this reality as unproblematic and given. So the phenomenologist, for de Beauvoir, in her specific understanding, does not reject the reality of the world, but questions its mode of reality. So it is in this sense that phenomenology seeks to abolish the opposition or the so-called opposition between the subject and the object. This is de Beauvoir again. It is impossible to define an object apart from the subject by whom and for whom it is the object. And the subject reveals itself only in relation to the objects that it is engaged with, end of quote. So the nature of de Beauvoir's engagement with philosophy, given the content and range of her other literary writings, was a refusal to accept the construction of systems of philosophy and to reject what she would call all finalities of history. Neither system nor history, she says, this is a quote from her, could any more than the malicious demon cancel the living certainty of I am, I exist, at this place and moment me. So instead of system building for de Beauvoir, she emphasized the role of questioning, of problematizing, and of writing as a place in which intersubjectivity, or the relation to the world, can be realized. Thus, de Beauvoir begins the second sex by asking, does woman exist? Will they always exist? Is it desirable that they exist? And this isn't meant to question the reality of woman's existence, but to ask, how does woman exist? Is her being real? What is reality when it is stated? She responds to these by making first a provisional argument. Not every human being is necessarily a woman, this is de Beauvoir. In order to be a woman, not every female human being is necessarily a woman. In order to be a woman, one must participate in the mysterious and threatened reality, which is femininity, end of quote. So femaleness is necessary in a certain reality, but not a sufficient condition, she's posing, for making a woman. There's a separation in de Beauvoir's writing between femaleness, femininity, and womanhood. She uses the concept of feminine existence and not the concept of woman to describe the reality of femininity, and not simply to just deny it. So she proceeds to deny any essence, any eternal unchanging essence to femininity, in order to argue that it is a process of becoming. She says, to be a woman is a process of becoming. It is not a fixed reality, but a becoming. So this conception is ultimately anchored in the way de Beauvoir understands the body, the living body. For her, the body is not a given thing, but again, a way of relating to things, a way of acting and being affected in the world. So the feminine and the masculine are thus not different and fixed entities, but variations of what she calls human embodiment. To tell the truth, this is a quote from de Beauvoir, man, like woman, is flesh, and therefore a passivity. And she, like him, in the midst of her carnal fever, is a consenting, a voluntary gift and activity. They live in their different ways the strange ambiguity of existence made body. However, the relationship between man and woman, this is the problem, is not symmetrical for de Beauvoir. He is the subject, he is the absolute, and she is the other. This is a quote, I think it's on your handout. So woman is the product of what de Beauvoir is calling a patriarchal mythology and a masculine ideology that exploits sexual difference to create systems of inequality. Equality, as de Beauvoir meant it, is not to be equal in terms of to be the same, but is one that must be accomplished despite difference, an acknowledgement of difference. So she argued that claims for equality risk erasing sexual difference in order to establish the masculine subject again as the absolute human. And this is a long quote from de Beauvoir. Now, what peculiarly signalizes the situation of woman is that she, a free and autonomous being like all human creatures, nevertheless finds herself living in a world where men compel her to assume the status of the other. They propose to stabilize her as object and to doom her to assume the status, and to doom her to imminence, since her transcendence is to be overshadowed and forever transcended by another ego, by conscience, which is essential and sovereign. The drama of woman lies in this conflict between the fundamental aspirations of every subject, of every ego, who always regards the self as the essential, and the compulsions of a situation in which she is the inessential. How can a human being in woman's situation attain fulfillment? What roads are open to her? Which are blocked? How can independence be recovered in a state of dependency? What circumstances limit woman's liberty, and how can they be overcome? These are the fundamental questions on which I, de Beauvoir, would fain throw some light. This means that I'm interested in the fortunes of the individual as defined not in terms of happiness, for de Beauvoir, but in terms of liberty, of the question of freedom, end of quote. So by saying that woman is the other, she employs this kind of somewhat quasi-Hegelian understanding of a dialectical relationship between the self and the other that is based on a relationship of negativity, on negation. So the self needs to be recognized by the other in the process of development of consciousness. And of course, de Beauvoir says otherness is a fundamental category of human thought. The other in this process, as she argues, is reduced to the self-same, does not have any alterity or authentic specificity. Another way to think of the self-other is the master-slave relation. The master, or man, is assumed to have absolute knowledge, while the slave has to work and labor without knowledge. So the slave is both subjected and also actively shapes her own nature. Her own natural inclinations are somewhat shaped through work, through embodiment, through labor. So this is why de Beauvoir's foremost critique is directed against the supposed naturalness of motherhood. Refusing maternity and motherhood as what is enforced on the subject, de Beauvoir complicates and refuses the monolithic notion of maternal desire as the essence of femaleness. Her aim with this move is to destabilize the masculine idea of a mother. So in the second sex, the familiar figure of the mother becomes an uncanny figure of the maternal. In fact, she argues that this enforced maternality splits the female subject internally. The maternal body is the site within which de Beauvoir gives us this image. The species takes residence in the subject's body. Enforced maternity through this containment of female desire. She reads maternity as this kind of containment of female desire by patriarchal law. Calls forth a subject whose desire is meant to coincide with her natural calling. So woman's desire, so she's trying to problematize the idea of woman's desire is desire to be a mother, okay? So the fetus, as such, in her reading, is seen as something that is parasitical, as what robs the woman of her entity, as the species taking residence in the subject's body. To quote her, the species takes residence in the woman's body and asserts itself against her separateness, end of quote. So this war between woman and the species begins with coitus, with the sexual relation. She says, and I quote her, "First violated, the female is then alienated. She becomes in part another than herself," end of quote. So de Beauvoir purposefully adopts this terminology of reproductive biology in order to amplify. So this is kind of like her discursive strategy, to amplify the absurdity of male utterances in physiology and biology that deduce the reproductive function of the female from that of an egg. Again, to quote de Beauvoir, the egg is imagined to be a little female, the woman a giant egg, end of quote. So the point for de Beauvoir was to render comical this kind of mode of writing or this kind of mode of discussion, to render comical what appears to be a scientific certitude, an evidence for deducing the woman's place as being in the home, as being in the position of a mother. So the maternal body in which the physician, the priest, and the philosopher for de Beauvoir have inscribed the supposed blissful coexistence of the mother and child to be is where the site of the problem precisely begins, okay? So patriarchy, for de Beauvoir, has to affirm the mother as a subject to secure what she calls the humanist idea of the subject. So for de Beauvoir, the mother as a subject is a complete illusion because she is deprived of speech. She is the mute, phallic mother, as she puts it, of infantile fantasy, and the mute, loving mother of masculinist representation. So ultimately, de Beauvoir presents us with an understanding of the body, or of embodiment, as a historical idea and not as a natural fact. It is not a question of what the human female is or what the maternal body is, but what has humanity, for her, the question is, what has humanity made of the female? So she inscribes conflict consistently by raising such questions. What is staged in her denaturalization of motherhood is a war between woman and the species, a refusal to define the female subject by her reproductive capacity. So for de Beauvoir, the female body has a material reality, but it has no intrinsic essential meaning apart from the discourses of gender. This is one of her ultimate points. Thus, and in agreement with one can see it as an agreement with psychoanalysis, as an agreement with Freudian psychoanalysis, that de Beauvoir understood the materiality of the body as what is lived by the subject. To quote her, it is not the object, it is not the object, the body object described by biologists that actually exists, but the body as lived by the subject. End of quote. Thus, the bearing of maternity on a woman is not the child to be inside her abdomen, but is patriarchy. So this is what she's saying. It is the name of the father. It is the cultural and socio-symbolic meaning of the species called man. Okay, for her, this is the argument she's making about this, the question of motherhood. So de Beauvoir's discursive strategy, her constant railing against maternity, pregnancy, childhood, and reproductive labor, her expressions of disgust and horror are used in a way to stage this kind of confrontation. What she's doing is staging a confrontation between man and his other. So by destabilizing this, what she's calling this kind of imaginary other of man, the aim is to destabilize the position of masculinity in her strategy. So she can be seen to exaggerate the description of the existence of the other, the woman as this kind of what is being taken over by this parasitical patriarchal ideology. This kind of exaggeration is meant to describe the other to an extent that it becomes so horrible that what it threatens to uphold is threatened. So what it is seen to uphold is threatened, masculine subjectivity itself. So de Beauvoir argues that the male dread or horror from the female body is a fear of man's own immanence, of his own corporeal limitations, the fear of becoming a woman, the fear of the mother. This is in her interpretation. So this fear is projected outside the self, and this is why woman must be constituted as other, as an externalized difference. De Beauvoir's most important contribution, one can suppose, is an alternative theory of subjectivity, or of the subject, that is in fact somewhat a materialist one. So by analyzing motherhood and the maternal ideal as places within which the woman is a non-subject, Beauvoir reminds us that in order to counter the patriarchal order, the position of woman within it must be altered. So it's not simply a critique in ideas, it's about a transformation in existing social relations that needs to happen in order for this state of inequality to be overcome. So her most important contribution is that sexual identity is in no way determined by a biological mechanism, but is learned through dynamics of identification and gender, and implicated. This is really annoying. Okay, so what de Beauvoir. Her important contribution is that sexual identity is in no way determined by a biological mechanism, but is learned through dynamics of identification and gender, and implicated in a system of production that is specific for her to modern capitalism. So this should make sense for you, given that you've read Marx already in the course. What de Beauvoir early on was aware of is that the socialist revolutions that had already happened, okay, had not yet succeeded in emancipating women from patriarchy, and that indeed there cannot be a social revolution without the emancipation of women. So I end my part of the lecture with a selection from an interview with de Beauvoir 25 years later after the publication of The Second Sex. She says, this consciousness among women that the class struggle does not embody the sex struggle is what is new. This is what she's speaking for. Yet most women in the struggle know that now. That's the greatest achievement of the feminist movement. It is one which will alter history in the years to come. And she is asked by the interviewer, but such a consciousness is limited to the women who are on the left. That is, women who are committed to the restructuring of the whole of society. What does de Beauvoir answer? She says, well, of course, since the rest are conservative, meaning they want to conserve what has been or what is. Women on the right do not want revolution. They are mothers, wives, devoted to their men. Or if they are agitators at all, they want a bigger piece of the pie. They want to earn more, elect more women to parliament, see a woman become president. They fundamentally believe in inequality, except they want to be on top rather on the bottom. But they will fit fine into the system as it is, or as it will change a bit to accommodate such demands. Capitalism can certainly afford to allow women to join an army, allow women to join a police force. Capitalism is certainly intelligent enough to let more women join the government. Pseudo-socialism can certainly allow a woman to become secretary general of its party. These are just reforms, like social security or a paid vacation. Did the institutionalization of paid vacations change the inequality of capitalism? Did the right of women to work in factories at equal pay as the men change the male orientation of, well, just talking about the really existing socialism of Czech society, but to change the whole value system of either society, to destroy the concept of motherhood, that is revolutionary. So again, one last quote from Beauvoir. A feminist, whether she calls herself leftist or not, is a leftist by definition. She is struggling for total equality, for the right to be as important, as relevant as any man. Therefore, embodied in her revolt for sexual equality is the demand for class equality. In a society where the male can be the mother, where to push the argument on values so it becomes clear, the so-called female intuition is as important as the male's knowledge, to use today's absurd language, this is her, where to be gentle or soft is better than to be hard and tough. In other words, in a society where each person's experiences are equivalent to any other, you have automatically set up equality, which means economic and political equality and much more. Thus, the sex struggle embodies the class struggle, but the class struggle does not embody the sex struggle. Feminists are therefore genuine leftists. In fact, they are to the left of what we now traditionally call the political left. So I stop here, and my colleague Angela will somewhat give us another angle of kind of the implications of these kind of feminist ideas that you see kind of condensed in de Beauvoir's works, the implications of these on something like artistic practice or the making of art in the past century. Okay.
So I'll start where my colleague Nadia left off, and in the remaining 20 minutes, I will sketch out some of the trajectories for feminist art practice that the Beauvoir second sex opened up in the 60s and 70s and beyond. And I'll sketch the reception in terms of two problematics posed by what came to be a foundational book in the post-60s feminist art practice that was artistic, political, and theoretical all at once. So the 60s second wave feminism, and I'll explain in a moment, came to challenge social, economic, and cultural inequalities between the sexes and pose the questions regarding reproductive rights, the ownership of the body, and women's representation in the public sphere. The two lines of inquiry opened up by Simone de Beauvoir and often most pertinently taken up by feminist art practices are what I identify as, number one, household labor and social reproduction, and two, the subject-object binary with the body acting as a threshold that enacts this performative opposition. So rather than constructing a comprehensive survey or providing a certain genealogical development from the Beauvoir to what came to be categorized as second wave feminism between, let's say, 1960s and early 80s, I will focus on a few key examples in relation to the propositions stemming from the second sex. The artworks here are not meant to illustrate Beauvoir's theory, but in and of themselves are conceived as interventions in art history as well as in theory and radical politics at the same time. So I'll start with my first category, and I could have gone to identify other themes, but I chose to focus on two: labor, sex, and social reproduction. So the Beauvoir's philosophical project is ultimately, and as Dr. Bou-Ali argued, a political one. Following Marx, who famously said, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. End of the quote. And if for Marx the political task was to make the proletariat visible as a subject of history, for de Beauvoir in the mid-20th century the woman shares a similar invisibility that was afforded to the proletariat in the 19th century. Second Sex's philosophical project is based on the understanding that previous theories and practices of liberation cannot be fully applied to women. If the goal of the proletariat in its historical struggle of appropriation of the means and outcomes of labor is to abolish the bourgeoisie and itself as a class, I'm sure you remember this hopefully from the Communist Manifesto, and if in its radical rendering the goal of the colonized people is to kill the colonized oppressor, women's liberation cannot pass through the abolition of men. Though in certain radical feminist practices in the 70s, namely one woman named Valerie Solanas, she started a society called SCUM, meaning Society of Cutting Up Men, which she took very literally of exterminating men from the surface of earth. But this is just a side note. So if women's goal cannot be abolition of men, then the Beauvoir says the bond that unites her to her oppressor is not comparable to any other. The division of the sexes is a biological fact, not an event in human history. Male and female stand opposed within a primordial Mitsein, which is a bridge, and woman has not broken it. The couple is a fundamental unity with its two halves riveted together, and the cleavage of society along the line of sex is impossible. Here is to be found the basic trait of woman. She is the other in a totality of which the two components are necessary to one another. End of the quote. The woman's peculiar historical situatedness, the spaces they inhabit, and the kind of labor they perform, predominantly confined to the domestic sphere, do not allow for an advent of something akin to class consciousness. In the 19th century, for Marx, industrial capitalism allowed for collectivization of labor, for hundreds and thousands of men and women to share the space of work, and through the shared space also experience alienation collectively, their own conditions collectively. Out of these shared conditions in spaces of collective labor, possibilities of mobilization would arise that would overturn the conditions of oppression. Unlike the proletariat that would develop class consciousness through the shared experience of work, women's primary site of labor is the household, a private and isolated sphere of the bourgeois individual wherein work does not appear as labor, as value-generating activity or wage, but as a set of tasks performed on the grounds of emotional attachment, love, caring, and so on. As the Beauvoir says, and I quote, "We have seen what poetic veils are thrown over her monotonous burden of housekeeping and maternity. In exchange for her liberty, she has received the false treasures for her femininity." End of the quote. Here the commodity's mystical veil reappears as a veil of her femininity as a romantic and quasi-metaphysical construct. So the veiling of labor via the ideology of femininity is especially present in the history of art as a discipline whose primary occupation since the 19th century has been the construction of the patrilineage of style and influence leading from one genius male artist to another. And feminist theory and practice of the 60s and 70s came to revisit and revise this canon of art history. By canon, we mean a set of regulations, unwritten and rules that provide the quality, that speak for a quality of masterworks, genius artists, and their succession. So the feminist theory and practice came to ask the question of who and why has been included and who and why has been excluded from the Leonardo da Vinci to Jackson Pollock pantheon. In a 1972 essay, art historian Linda Nochlin, who unfortunately passed away yesterday, asked, "Why have there been no great women artists?" And basically the question is, why do we have Michelangelo, Raphael, Titian, and no women artists in this pantheon of master figures? And her answer was not to excavate and find great women artists who were neglected and forgotten by art history, though this was and is being done as well, but to question the ideology of genius and greatness on the one hand, and situate the very question historically, in terms of the conditions of women within the institution of pre-modern and then bourgeois family. Nochlin instead asks, did women historically have access to art education? and more specifically to anatomy and to the naked body and the dissected corpse. It was anatomical drawing, after all, that became one of the key conditions for mastery in painting since the period of Renaissance. If the material conditions and patriarchal family relations did not permit women's entrance to art academies and artists' workshops, how could there be great women artists? After all, greatness does not spring somewhere from the soul or is biologically determined, but is a category constructed via social institutions, and amongst these institutions, art history. The feminist theory of the 60s and 70s was an arrow with two main targets. Number one, to undo what was perceived as a biased distinction between so-called low culture and high art. Low culture meaning, let's say, craft or popular culture, mass culture, and high art designating painting, sculpture, that would be confined to the sphere of museums. So they they challenged this dichotomy or this antagonism between low culture and high art by addressing the question of artist labor. And number two, they attempted to make visible the unspoken and unseen labor of women in the household. So the labor of women and artistic labor are confined in this question of emancipation of the feminine subjectivity via art. In the sharp distinctions that modern art drew between non-purposeful, autonomous high artworks and utilitarian objects, meaning artworks are there to contemplate upon, they are encapsulate beauty and sublime and so on, whereas utilitarian objects are for use, right? We make use of them. You cannot use art the way you'd use a coffee cup, for example. So the sharp distinctions that modern art drew between non-purposeful autonomous art and utilitarian objects, the often male painter whose sexuality is veiled behind the myth of his status as a master of intentionality, produces artworks that reflect his unique soul, revealed in the unrepeatable painterly mark. And we shouldn't forget this is a period following immediately abstract expressionism, and especially Jackson Pollock's painting. If you guys know Pollock's technique, he put the canvas horizontally, and through performative gestures, he dipped paint on the canvas, and this was called dip painting as well, or action painting. And Pollock was analyzed basically or interpreted in art criticism of his time as a singular master whose unique signature produces irreproducible, authentic artwork. So there's a very, very also masculine connotation in this art critical reception of Pollock. And this very kind of expressionism, right? The unique subjectivity of the artist expresses his freedom on the surface of the canvas, is in its core. This was the feminist critique that followed, is male because it produces a virile and heroic subject of absolute freedom. So these paintings were also often called ejaculatory paintings, where here the canvas becomes a space of exercising the freedom of the free subject. So as opposed to this, female labor has been historically designated to the production of crafts and utilitarian objects in the household. These, unlike paintings that supposedly mark transcendence from the banality of everyday life, are confined to the world of necessity and need. So the sites of female labor, housework, reproduction, production of crafts became sites of intervention for artists who declared that, this is a famous quote, a slogan, the personal is political. In 1972, Californian artists Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro opened Woman House, a collective space for cohabiting, educating, thinking, and exhibiting. The exhibition that they staged in the same year was conceived as a performative rite of passage of becoming a woman, with multiple rooms called nursery, nurturer's kitchen, menstruation room, and sheet closet. The visitor participant would be led through the space where women were performing everyday acts that make up the idea of womanhood. These performances created a total environment that fused ritualistic theater with everyday gendered tasks. On the one hand, they denaturalized women's everyday labor by staging it as a theatrical yet everyday act, and on the other hand, challenged the idea that art is a detached object for contemplation. That is something outside of you that you admire, you make a disinterested judgment, and so on. This performance is created, here the women's artist's body made visible was conceived as an attack on the status of art as a self-sufficient object displayed in the seemingly neutral space of the museum and producing a unique aesthetic experience. Similarly, Judy Chicago's 1974-79 dinner party staged yet another assault on the art historical and intellectual canon. This monumental work comprised an installation of a large triangular table that served as a femage, or rather than an homage, to 990 women in history. This so-called Last Supper honored famous and infamous, neglected, forgotten, and erased writers, artists, composers, and philosophers. The more prominent amongst them had a seat at the dinner table covered with a handmade tablecloth and porcelain floral and valver forms, symbolizing the guests. The rest had their names inscribed on porcelain tiles, composing the base of the table. This matrilineage, as opposed to patrilineage, served for reclaiming women as subjects of history and representation through labor traditionally ascribed to women, sewing, knitting, pottery making, and so on, the very materials used for the installation. Another artist who consistently engaged with the question of labor in the 60s and 70s as a means of institutional critique, meaning critiquing the institution of family and the institution of high art, such as museums and art spaces, was Mirle Laderman Ukeles. In a 1969 maintenance art manifesto, she writes, I quote, development, pure individual creation, the new, change, progress, advance, excitement, fight or fleeing, maintenance, keep the dust off the pure individual creation, preserve the new, sustain the change, protect progress, defend and prolong the advance, renew the excitement, repeat the flight. By bringing a key enlightenment category, development, and the tedious work of maintenance together, Ukeles pointed at maintenance that goes into keeping alive the pillars of modernity, the ideas of change, progress, and the new. Ultimately, she enacted a series of performances where she cleaned the floors and stairs of museums, for set hours, and she referred to these activities as floor paintings, or dust paintings. Here we do not only have the intrusion of domestic labor onto the space of the museum, performed by a woman who is an artist, but also the very labor that goes into maintaining spaces that house products of high culture is made visible. The maintenance of the display case would normally be the janitor's responsibility, but once made a work of art, it enters into the territory of the conservator. In Chicago's and Ukeles' works, the critique of the institutional conditions of art is not separable from the critique of the institutional structures of patriarchy, including its seemingly most natural sphere, the domestic sphere. Dr. Bou-Ali already mentioned the centrality of the question of the subjects for Simone de Beauvoir, and this is the last 5 minutes I will trace the subject-object binary in feminist art practices. And it was precisely this question that became paradigmatic for the 70s theory and art practice that took up psychoanalysis as a weapon against patriarchy and against psychoanalysis' own biases towards the masculine subject. Artist Mary Kelly's durational work, completed over the course of 6 years, entitled Postpartum Document, documents the birth and development of her son through a double narrative: the child's entry to history, language, and social institutions, and the mother's loss of her son to these institutions as the child becomes separated from the mother. Using the tools provided by psychoanalysis, Kelly's ethnographic theoretical investigation centered on the possibility of female fetishism. She meticulously collected and presented the residues of her child as signs or indexes of female fetishism: diapers, scribbles, clothes, first writings, and so on. Numerous charts, graphs, theoretical reflections combined with these emblems of the mother's desire point at the domestic labor of sexual reproduction as an intrinsic part of social production, including the production of desire through luck. The so-called archaeology of the everyday, in Kelly's own words, debunks the double myth of the artist genius who effaces the traces of work and the labor of sexual reproduction as non-work. But in addition, Kelly's deep investment in theory claims this traditionally masculine domain for the female artist. In the 70s, the body art practice is most productively engaged with the subject and object binary. The body here acted not only as a site upon which the patriarchal violence is enacted, but also as a means to challenge the politics of representation within art history, where women were seen as objects of representation whose bodies had been pacified via idealization by predominantly male artists. So basically, politics of representation means artists were asking who is included in art history books, in museums, and who is excluded. And they found patriarchal and gendered aspects in these questions. Here, artists such as Shigeko Kubota, Karoli Schneemann, Hanna Wilke, and Vito Acconci use their own bodies in performances, video installations, and photographic series as works of art. So the body becomes an artwork. In this work, the subject who represents and the object of representation are not oppositional to and separate from one another. The artist is the subject who makes the artwork, her body, makes the artwork, and her body is the material for making art, and this body constitutes the artwork itself. Kubota's this was the example of the politics of representation of male artists painting nudes art historically. And Kubota's 1965 performance called Vagina Painting, where the artist makes an abstract expressionist work by a dangled brush coming out of her crotch, is a commentary on abstract expressionist painting of the 50s, and particularly on Jackson Pollock. I already showed Pollock's photograph. Unlike Pollock's work, where the very result, the painting, has been made sacred in the museological order of modern art, as he was hailed by Life magazine as the greatest American painter as early as 1949. And if you go to the MoMA, you see Pollock's huge canvas occupying a very prominent space. In Kubota's work, it is there's the MoMA picture. It is the ephemeral and durational performance that constitutes the work of art rather than the end result in the form of painting. Karoli Schneemann's 1975 performance similarly brings in the sexed and partial subject as both an object and subject of representation. In Interior Scroll, philosopher, art historian, artist, and filmmaker Schneemann pulls a paper scroll out of her vagina while reading philosophical texts from it. In this, the subject and object binaries, the woman as belonging to nature, to immanence, as opposed to the transcendental male artist-philosopher, are not undone but are enacted performatively via an intersection of the body and the world, the self and the other. As an object of desire who puts her naked body in front of the audience, Schneemann is also a desiring subject who performs transcendence as a philosopher, as an artist. And I'm finishing here. The Beauvoir second sex opened up avenues for feminist praxis that throughout the 60s and 70s women's liberation movement and beyond challenged the authority of normative discourses, institutional values, and the politics of representation. In feminist art practice in particular, it is not politics as a theme that became an object of representation, let's say let's paint protests, no, but representation itself was conceived as a political act. Again, the question of inclusion and exclusion and the sex and gender aspects in this. And I will finish here. This is a non-exhaustive list.